6 years of former President Trump's tax returns are now available for public scrutiny. He fought for years to keep them secret, but on Friday, a House committee released them. And they're raising a lot of questions about his finances, like why did he pay little or no federal income tax in some years? Take a look. In 2016 and 2017, Trump paid only $750. In 2020, the final year of his presidency, he did not pay a dime in federal income tax. Trump offsetting his income by claiming millions of dollars in losses, raising questions about the former president's business failures. The returns also show Trump maintained foreign bank accounts while serving in the White House, including in China. Joining me now, CNN contributor and Trump biographer Michael D'Antonio. He's the author of the book, The Truth About Trump. All right, Michael, we know Trump famously fought hard to keep these returns from being made public. Now that they're out, what does he do?
Well, it seems to me that he's got both an image problem and maybe a legal issue, although others could speak perhaps to the legal problems better than I might. Politically, he's got two sub-issues here. One is that these returns suggest that he really isn't the great businessman that he claims to be. And certainly all these losses would cause many of us to think so. On the other hand, he might argue that these are paper losses and they're not really a sign that he wasn't doing well or that he wasn't living well or that his personal wealth was suffering. That explanation actually leads to the other political issue that he has, that being that someone who lives so lavishly and who claims to be worth up to 10 or 11 billion in net worth should be paying some sort of tax were this system to be fair or were he to be a good citizen, because paying our taxes is part of participating in our society. Actually, you might say it funds the defense of democracy, both internationally and at home. So he's got big political issues here, and I think it only further erodes an already wounded presidential campaign ambition that he has.
He has argued, and likely would argue, that the tax system is inherently unfair, but he has argued that he took advantage of the laws as they are written because he is, quote, smart. Your take on that?
Well, I think he's got dozens and dozens of people around him who are smart when it comes to taxes. This is another case, just as with his claims to knowing more about the law than most lawyers, where he's just making stuff up. He doesn't exhibit intelligence himself when it comes to tax policy. He only knows enough to hire people who know all the tricks. So none of these methods are new. What's, I think, remarkable is that he uses every single one of them. And I've noted this before in other arenas of his life, and that is that he will grab as aggressively $1,000 as he will $1 million. And we've all heard stories of people that he's decided not to pay, small contractors or people that he's interrupted transactions with just to make new demands. So sure, he's hired a bunch of smart people, but if he were truly smart, he would have paid some taxes knowing that eventually all of this would come out. And for him to imagine that it wouldn't come out, I think was really foolish.
It did take a very long time to come out. But what do you make of the fact that his charitable contributions in 2020 were zero?
Well, isn't that remarkable? He, in the past, used parts of his organization to appear to make charitable donations, although it was often for his benefit. And in one case that's noted in these audit or in these papers that have been released, he claimed a far greater value of a donation of land that he made many years ago in order to reap the tax benefits of this excess valuation. And the committee has identified this as a serious problem. And it's part of why the state of New York went after his businesses. So I would imagine too that the people overseeing the operation of his business, now that it's been convicted, are going to look at these tax records, look at the practices that maybe the remaining executives would like to repeat and disallow them.
I also want to ask you about some revelations that came out of new transcripts from the January 6th committee. This was some testimony from Trump's former press secretary, Stephanie Grisham. Quote, I heard from several people in the West Wing, more on the military aid or Secret Service side, and then a couple just people, but that he was sitting in the dining room and he was just watching it all unfold. And a couple of his comments, some of his comments were that these people looked very trashy, but also looked like fighters. What is your impression of that?
Well, I think that day, January 6th, was in some way the culmination of all of the dreams that Donald Trump has ever had. When he was a very young fellow, he went to a military academy where they did pretend soldiering. And I think that was something that instilled in him this idea of being a leader of a violent organization. Later, he would say that the movie Patton, about a general who abused his troops, was one of his favorite movies, and that Patton represented the kind of leader he hoped to be. So now we have on January 6th, him watching what is essentially a mob with both some revulsion, because he's actually someone who looks down on ordinary Americans, but I think also some real pleasure, because he's activated people to risk their lives and to risk and almost, I guess in one case, take the life of someone in the melee. And this was something I think that delighted him.
Michael D'Antonio, thank you.
Thank you.